Thanks very much, Tim. Welcome back. Look, before we start the discussion, I'll introduce the panel. 3 experts in their field, and all of them well acquainted with the issues raised by Sirocco. Firstly, Kamal Fadel, the representative in Australia and New Zealand of the Polisario, the UN recognised representative organisation of the people of Western Sahara. Dr. Meredith Burgmann, formerly the President of the New South Wales Legislative Council, and right from the get-go of AWSA, a member and staunch supporter and provider of strategic advice for us here in Australia. And she went to the camps in the refugee camps in Algeria in 2004. Dr. Randi Irwin, an anthropologist, has visited a number of times more recently as she was writing her doctoral dissertation, and she now is in Australia and works in the lectures in the sociology department of the University of Newcastle. So welcome the 3 of you, 3 of our panelists. And I think the easiest thing will probably be for Tim to sort of throw to the people asking questions if they want to ask them in person. Otherwise, it'll be a fairly free-flowing discussion, and I think Tim and I have got some questions to ask, because you may have noticed that there was a mention of the refugees being the oldest refugees being there for 40 years. Well, this year we marked 44 years of National Day of the Saharawi Arab Democratic Republic. So there's 4 years of perhaps a bit of catch up and updating of information, particularly in relation to the phosphate and the exploitation of phosphate by Morocco. That's one thing where there's a lot happening, and I think people might be interested in what's happening with the pandemic in that part of the world. So I'll throw to you, Tim. And
yeah, so we've got a question here from Paul Reed, and I'll just remind everyone, if you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A box. Just type it in, and then I can pass over to you. So Paul, I'm just going to pass to you now with your question. I think your mic should be on.
Should we just read Paul's question? Do you want me to just read it?
Yeah, if that's not working, Paul, we'll just, yeah, I'll just read that out then. It says, can Kamal or Randi tell all of us online the names of the UN member countries that won't support Western Sahara's self-determination?
Which is a fantastic and very large question. I can answer that in one of 2 ways, and I'll then sort of hand it over to Kamal here. But on one hand, I could list all of the countries that don't support it, but I think it might be more useful to talk about who's gatekeeping the processes that prevent the referendum from moving forward. So the referendum is one of the primary ways through which Sahrawis might vote for their independence, which was the guaranteed right under the ceasefire in 1991. And that referendum hasn't happened. Now there's an entire UN mission that's set up to enable that referendum, but that just hasn't happened, which hasn't allowed that process to move forward. Currently, I believe there are 45 countries that recognize the Saharawi Arab Democratic Republic as sovereign. Those numbers sometimes are in flux. You can find a full list on a website, which I can link to in the chat. So you can see who has recognized the government, and then you from there deduce who hasn't. But perhaps more importantly, is a recognition of how the referendum might happen, and that relies on the Security Council of the United Nations. And right now, there's something called the Group of Friends. Now, those are 5 countries: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Spain, and Kamal. Who's the 5th? Off the top of my head, is it
China, Russia?
It's Russia, I think. It's Russia, right? I believe it's Russia as the 5th. And those 5 countries hold a large number of the current administering power, the current non-self-governing territories in the world. And they're also responsible for decolonizing or setting up the process by which this has happened. France has a huge stake in supporting Morocco. And it's worth mentioning that the northern border of Morocco has 2 Spanish enclaves in it. Now, those Spanish enclaves are Spanish cities, and if you get into the Spanish enclave, you can claim asylum. And if you're a migrant and you get into Spain there, you're within the European Union. So essentially, Morocco does a significant amount of border policing for the European Union, which is something that we don't necessarily think about because we think about the Mediterranean, we think about there being a water space there. But the European Union's border is actually in Morocco via Ceuta and Melilla, which changes the relationship and the dependencies between Spain, between France, between larger European Union interests. And I think that's one thing that's worth flagging, that really it's worth targeting the Group of Friends and putting pressure on the P5 or the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, in addition to the Group of Friends. So Kamal, I'll hand that over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I take this opportunity to thank AWSA, the Australia Western Sahara Association, for organizing this event, and the feeder. We haven't had an event like this in the past, and we have had a long break since the beginning of the pandemic. So it's good to see that we're coming back into action, raising awareness and talking about this issue in Australia. With regard to the question, I think Randi answered the question. I don't have much to add, except that it is mainly France that has been, providing support to Morocco and making sure that Morocco is not censored or condemned by the Security Council for its clear violations of the agreements it had signed under the United Nations auspices, particularly, the settlement plan of 1989, which enabled MINURSO, United Nations, to send a mission to Western Sahara called MINURSO in 1991. But also the, violations of the United Nations resolutions and its own charter, because Morocco, with its invasion and occupation of Western Sahara, it has violated the United Nations Charter and also various United Nations resolutions which called for the end of colonialism in Western Sahara. And there are specific resolutions by the Security Council and the General Assembly calling on Morocco to withdraw from Western Sahara and to abide by UN resolutions and charter. So the main culprit is France. But also there is some kind of tacit support at some stages during different administrations from the United States and also Spain. Due to the reasons Randi mentioned.
On that, Randi, you were talking about Spain's doorstep in Northern Africa, the 2 cities there. There's a few more questions coming in, but just another little additional question is, Since the new Spanish government has been elected, they've got a new left-wing coalition government. Is there any kind of political movement within that government to change the historical position?
Not that I've been on top of in the last couple of months, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. The issue though with the Spanish border is that because it's part of the European Union, that it's more than just Spain putting that pressure on the policing. So Spain can receive pressure from the European Union to make sure that those borders are managed. So there's a point of pressure there available now with the Spanish government, but it is still susceptible to larger pressures within the European Union, which is really where some of that force comes through.
Yeah. And Paul, just thanks to you both for your detailed answers. We'll go to another question now. I'm just going to try this live answer one more time. I'll pass to Ronald Guy. I'll just invite him to see if that audio works. Is that working, Ron? I think we've got a bit of a glitch here, but I'll just read out that question then. Ronald says, what is happening in New Zealand are phosphate imports?
Kamal?
Yes. Well, we're glad that, for example, it's worth mentioning that we have no more any Australian companies importing phosphate from Western Sahara, which we have campaigned on for many, many years to make sure that they stop. So the 3 Australian companies stopped, and so did many others. For example, the Canadian companies, the Americans, the Europeans, and in the Western world, only New Zealand remains involved through 2 companies, one called Ravensdown and Balance Agri-Nutrients. And they are cooperatives in New Zealand. And they have been importing phosphate for the past 30 years from Western Sahara through Morocco, which is illegal and unethical and immoral. The pressure on these companies has increased tremendously in the last few years. A lot of, the public awareness has increased in New Zealand, the media interest, and the public in general awareness also, and the activities of our fantastic friends in New Zealand also has contributed to pressure on these companies. And the pressure has increased due to the fact that you would remember in 2017, a ship carrying a cargo of phosphates was arrested in Port Elizabeth in South Africa through an action by us, the Polisario and the ASADR. And the South African High Court ruled that the cargo belongs to the people of Western Sahara, not to Morocco, and handed over that cargo to the Saharawi authorities. It was a very interesting ruling, a strong one, a clear one, which underlined that Morocco has no right to exploit Western Sahara resources, and contracts with Morocco in terms of the resources of Western Sahara would be invalid. This created a lot of fear amongst international companies. Most of them withdrew, and also insurance companies, maritime transport companies have stopped quite a few, Maersk, for example. And the New Zealand companies are very nervous. But unfortunately, they continue to be really intransigent and they don't want to listen. And we had to, for example, begin in March this year, a legal case in New Zealand against the guardians of the super fund in New Zealand, which is linked to these companies. And that legal case is progressing. Interestingly, a few days ago, the High Court in New Zealand ruled that the FANZ, which is the New Zealand Federation that includes the two companies, would be allowed to intervene with some conditions in this case, because they applied to join this case under the pretext that this case is going to affect their interest and could create a precedent, and they need to join the legal battle. So it shows how concerned the companies are, but how also they are determined to continue this illegal trade. We believe that we have a good case, taking into account that the law here is very clear in this instance, that the guardians are not allowed to do anything that will damage New Zealand's reputation and standing in the world. And there is no doubt that New Zealand's reputation and standing and credibility has been affected because of the actions of these companies and the guardians' involvement. Also, we have very strong precedents in the European Court of Justice and in the ruling I just mentioned in South Africa, and the fact that there is, an International Court of Justice opinion. A United Nations legal advisor has also issued a legal opinion which is clear, and that no country in the world recognizes Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara, therefore it is an illegal occupation. Morocco has no right to deal with Western Sahara's resources.
And just on that, Meredith, maybe you could tell us a bit more about Australia's position on Western Sahara and what we could hope to achieve in the UN.
Well, the main problem for Western Sahara in the Australian context is that so few people know anything about it. Whenever I try to talk to members of Parliament about it, you have to start with a geography lesson and then a bit of a history lesson. And the only way you really get through to them is when you say it's exactly the same as the East Timorese situation. When the colonial power Portugal left Timor in 1975, the aggressive neighbouring state Indonesia invaded. Well, exactly the same thing happened with Western Sahara when the Spanish colonial power left Western Sahara in 1975. It was invaded by Morocco and for a short time too by Mauritania. So once you start talking about it as being exactly the same as Timor, and also the fact that José Ramos Horta has been such a supporter of the Western Saharans, and he's often mentioned them in his own speeches. He talks about the Polisario as being the most ethical and best organised resistance group that he's ever dealt with, and that he says, and that's including his own. So that's the only way you really get any traction when you're talking to politicians. about Western Sahara. But with DFAT, you got a bit of movement under Rudd because he, in fact, liked the fact that he knew stuff, whereas the problem with the Liberal Party foreign ministers is they're very much captured by their department. And the DFAT position on Western Sahara has basically always been, you know, well, what can we do? We're so far away, blah, blah. And so they've never taken a leading role in trying to push for a referendum, which of course is technically the Australian position. The Australian position is that we support a United Nations referendum as per the many decisions of the United Nations General Assembly. But of course, we never do anything that would make the referendum happen. So really our job is to get more federal members of parliament more active on the issue.
Thanks, Meredith. We've got a question from Jared here. Now I've figured out finally how to have these questions done live. So I'm going to pass the mic to Jared. Give me 1 second. Jared, I think you're on now.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, sorry, there we go, it was set to the wrong mic. Hi, nice to see everyone. Yeah, just wanted to quickly, during the, we've seen other authoritarian governments during the pandemic who have passed legislation to restrict or remove certain rights like human rights. Have we seen anything similar in with the Moroccan government? Anyone?
Yeah. I'm happy to jump in first, or Kamal, if you want to take the lead, or Meredith.
You go ahead.
So in general, Morocco locked down movement very, very quickly in March. So there's been very little movement within Morocco. And that's sort of been across the board. And it prevents sort of transit between Western Sahara and Morocco in the same way that it prevents transit within other cities within Morocco. So there's that, and that's sort of been applied across the board from my understanding. Your question about specifically minimizing rights of Sahrawis under the guise of COVID-19 is a really interesting question that I think gets us back to the issue of the referendum and the ways in which Morocco actively seeks to make that impossible. So within the Moroccan constitution, there's no recognition of Sahrawis as a minority group, which is part of a larger historical project on Morocco's part to fold all Sahrawis into the classification of Moroccans more broadly, and thereby making the ability to mark out Sahrawis for the purposes of voting on the referendum sort of an impossible task. And so Morocco says, well, there are no minorities here. There's a sort of great quote from Morocco's guidebook on cultural and economic rights. It says, there are no minorities in Morocco. So Morocco actively seeks to never recognize Sahrawis as anything different in order to undercut any capacity for Sahrawis to push back within the occupied territories. It makes that a really untenable position. So it's the marking out of Sahrawi that is the point where violence really comes in, instead of actively trying to separate Sahrawis from the Moroccan population, which has really significant implications for the ongoing colonial project of occupation.
And we have a related question from Kurt. Kurt, I'll invite you to talk. You should be able to ask your question now. Kurt?
I think his mic's just not on.
Yeah, so Kurt just asked, are there any cases of COVID-19 in the camps or the occupied areas? And is it possible for people to get tested there?
Yeah, I'll talk about this and also the previous question. So let me start with the previous question about, what Morocco has been doing during this period. We have definitely witnessed an increase in, violations of human rights and restriction of movements by the authorities there, and detention of activists and fake trials. And yesterday, in the capital of Western Sahara, Laayoune, some Sahrawis, particularly a group of women, tried to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the uprising in Zimla, a suburb in Laayoune. An uprising happened on the 17th of June, 1970, against the Spanish colonialism. So people wanted to commemorate that event through a peaceful protest and distribution of leaflets and flyers, but the authorities, responded violently, beating the women, dragging them, and dispersing them with force. And I have seen, photos and videos of that action. So the pressure and the oppression has increased, and taking advantage of the fact that not many people are allowed to visit foreigners to the territory, and not many people are allowed, to film and talk about these acts of violence by the Moroccan authorities. We were, fortunate for some time that there were no cases of COVID-19 in Western Sahara, the occupied areas, until the Moroccans allowed Moroccan settlers to travel from Morocco into Western Sahara, particularly, fishermen who, I think it was fishing season starting now, and they did not, restrict their movements. They were not doing the proper things to, test them and make sure that no one came into the occupied areas with the illness. But we have witnessed a few cases, and I think yesterday or the day before also there were some positive cases, particularly by Moroccan settlers in Laayoune. In the camps, we have been so far lucky. We quickly, put in instruments that enable people to be safe, and an awareness campaign, and we have established a committee to meet regularly and issue, advice to the people. We undertook, activities of or actions, of cleaning the camps and doing all the things that are needed, and making sure that people don't gather together during this period. So far, no cases in the camps, which is great. And the Algerians have been very helpful in providing medical assistance to the camps and establishing a mobile hospital that is able to test people who need to be tested. So far so good in the camps and in the liberated areas. The only impact has been so far is in terms of food and medicine, because the camps depend on humanitarian assistance coming from overseas, particularly Europe, Spain, Italy, and that has been affected. And will continue to be, affected by that. No major issues, but we are concerned that if this situation continues, there will be serious impact on the refugee camps.
Thank you. So that's good news. No cases in the camps so far, and the response is ongoing. So we've got a few more questions. It's just been an hour now, I think since we started. So hopefully we can get through all the questions. I'll pass to Aileen. She's got a couple of questions, and I'll invite you to talk, Aileen. Hopefully this works.
Hi guys, thanks for the Q&A tonight. Had a couple of questions, maybe I can roll it into one. I was interested to know, because I don't have quite an idea of how much is the occupation of Western Sahara. What does it mean in economic terms for the countries that are getting the most out of it in that regard? Like, what is the value of what all these violations that they're committing over there? And is it Morocco, France, and US who are mostly gaining from that?
Thanks, Eileen.
Anybody wants to speak to this?
Oh, Kamal, you should.
Yeah, you should start.
Okay, I'll try. Well, I think there is no doubt that an important factor of Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara was for economic reasons. In addition to the size of Western Sahara and its strategic location. So Morocco benefits greatly from phosphates, from the fisheries, and from the agriculture, from the sand, from anything they could lay hands on. And there is a great potential for oil and gas and also mineral resources. So those countries that deal with Morocco, benefit also greatly through these resources. So part of the occupation is of course is economical, and in addition to all the factors that happened in the 70s in relation to the monarchy and the pressure that was on the monarchy inside Morocco, and using Western Sahara as a diversion for lack of reform in Morocco, to unite the people on so-called nationalist cause. Yeah, I hope maybe Randi, you might want to add something?
Yes, I'm very happy to add something. In terms of the question of economic and political interests, one of the things that I've found really interesting is going back through old US government communications as they're declassified, to see how people, particularly how the US government was perceiving the conflict as it happened. And I think Kamal's alluded to it there, but one of the primary things that I find interesting is the amount of pressure that was actually on the Moroccan monarchy, on Hassan II, from inside. So there was a general idea that Morocco was going to give up Western Sahara, that Hassan II was quite willing to do that. And then you see these political pushes. And so, as Kamal said, Western Sahara has really served as a way for the Moroccan monarchy at various iterations, including at Hassan II's death and in the transfer of power there, to shore up a particular form of Moroccan national identity that must be considered in parallel with the economic interests that Morocco absolutely benefits from. In terms of the issue of phosphate and how much money is moving in and out, it's really hard for me to answer that question, because it's really difficult to get a sense of where the resources are coming from as they're documented. So you see that some companies will catch fish from Western Sahara's waters, but then they bring them into port in Moroccan ports, and it's really hard to account for how much is actually coming out of Western Sahara, because it gets papered over with Moroccan stickers. So there's a great case that went forward coming out of the UK around tomatoes, because Western Sahara's tomatoes were being exported to the UK. And the sticker that went on those tomatoes was that they were from Morocco. And that's part of the larger process of sort of concealing the identity of and the origin of these resources, which makes it really difficult to track. And that's a feature, not an effect of this sort of colonialism and occupation, is to sort of obscure that. The other issue with the phosphate is that Morocco, or Western Sahara's phosphate, is of a very high grade. And so it's some of the world's most valuable phosphate, regardless of the quantity. So there's a large quantity of phosphate that exists there to begin with, but that phosphate is of a very high grade, and it's really close to the surface, which makes it far cheaper to mine and then to export, and it requires less refining. So there are all of these other components of the actual resources that make it harder to compare quantity between Morocco and Western Sahara, because there are different economic components that feature because of Western Sahara's geological structures.
Mm-hmm. And just on that question, maybe Meredith, maybe in your conversations with Australian parliamentarians and parties and DFAT, what do you think is driving Australian interests or motivations in Western Sahara? Is it more a geopolitical thing, aligning with American and European interests, or is there something else there?
I think it's very much the American alliance, and I sometimes have a bit of a difference with Kamal about this, but I think that a lot of things changed after 9/11, when America was looking for good Muslims. You know, they were looking for moderate allies that they could bolster. And I think Morocco just said, here's us, you know, the Western fun-loving king who, you know, jet skis and all that sort of thing. And I just think Morocco became more important to the Americans, and therefore harder for the Australians to take a independent line with about their bad behaviour, about having occupied another country. So I think it's very much tied up with the American alliance.
Yeah.
Can I say something? What we can note here is that all the governments that have been in place in Australia have adopted a positive position on Western Sahara, and I can, you know, see that from my meetings with the Department of Foreign Affairs. And even when Australia opened a couple of years ago, I think 2 or 3 years ago, an embassy in Rabat in Morocco, that position has not changed. And there was, for example, an interview with the Moroccan, with the Australian ambassador in Morocco, who stated clearly that we can agree with Morocco on a lot of things, and we want to develop, you know, our relations with Morocco on a lot of things, but Western Sahara remains an issue. And we will not, you know, our position remains the same thing. That is supporting the right to self-determination and the holding of the referendum. And also in terms of resources, the Department of Foreign Affairs has put on its website a warning to those who intend to import goods or things from Western Sahara to be aware that there are legal issues involved and to seek legal advice. I must say that the Labour Party and the unions in Australia and the and NGOs have adopted even more a better, more stronger position. Last Labour Party conference adopted a good resolution on Western Sahara, reaffirming a lot of other, resolutions that have been adopted in the past, or motions. The trade union ACTU has also adopted a similar resolution, and the union, the NGOs, ACFID organization has also adopted the resolution during its last conference, I think late last year, October probably. And there was a question from one of the participants about the role of unions in New Zealand. That has been really amazing. Particularly last year, also in October, the New Zealand trade union movement during its conference adopted a strong motion in favor of Western Sahara, asking the companies to stop their exploitation and asking the unions to extend their support. And since that resolution, we have witnessed a number of unions taking action at the ports or elsewhere, or participating in some of the protests held in New Zealand. So that's been really good and positive. And they also, the unions supported Tekber's, the Saharawi women who visited last year, visit to New Zealand, financially and otherwise.
Yes, I'd just like to add something. I think I was being a bit pessimistic about what we can expect from DFAT and Australian politicians. The Labor Party's had a very good position on Western Sahara since 2004 because the right and the left came together and we moved a very good motion, and it's been like that ever since. However, from about the last 7 or 8 years, Kamal, the Moroccans have been really moving very strongly to influence federal members of parliament. They've been offering free trips to Morocco, come to the Casbah and you will have this wonderful time. And there's a Friends of Morocco, Parliamentary Friends of Morocco group, and lots of MPs have gone off and come back, really sort of mouthing the Moroccan line. And it's been really hard to fight back against that. And so I do get a bit pessimistic because it's not front and centre on anyone's screen really, because it is a long way away, and traditionally we haven't been great on foreign policy issues anyway in Parliament. So I just think that yes, we have good policy, and yes, DFAT will put things up on their screen and things, but to actually get any movement inside the UN from Australia to get the referendum happening, it's hard to see. Well, certainly this present government doing that.
So we've gone through most of the questions. I think there's just one more question from Paul Reed. He wanted to clarify something about some claims by Ravensdown, that's the company in New Zealand exporting, I think. He's asking 75% of the known world's reserve of phosphate rock is in Morocco and only 2% in Western Sahara. Could the panel please comment?
Well, I think the problem with Ravensdown is that they have been taking, all their information from OCP. And they really rely on these information. OCP is a Moroccan company, which is mainly dealing with phosphates, and it's owned by the regime. So it's a government entity. And of course, they will give just information they want to give to Ravensdown. And there is a problem of relying by a company to rely on such information. I think there is some truth in the fact that, yes, if you put Morocco and Western Sahara together, there will be a 75% of world reserves. I heard, some numbers that Western Sahara has 35% of world reserves. And I'm not sure how much Morocco has, but it doesn't really, this is not the essence of the issue. It doesn't really matter if we only had 2%. We want to keep those 2% for ourselves. So Ravensdown has no right to import from Western Sahara through Morocco. It doesn't mean anything if that is even the case.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's not really the heart of the issue there. And I'm a little bit interested in knowing a bit more about how they've constructed Morocco, as Kamal says, because companies that work in Morocco and through Morocco tend to collapse the distinction between Morocco and Western Sahara there. So I'd be really interested in knowing where that classification actually comes from and how that geographic spread was calculated. So.
Okay, so I think we've gone through all of the questions. So thank you everyone for your questions. I think that was a great discussion. Heaps of questions. We've got about 30 people participating tonight. So thank you all for those questions. And I'll just draw attention to one comment we've got in the chat box from Carol. She says, clearly there's a lot of work to be done in Australia to raise the profile here. She just wants to say that as a polity, we don't have a lot of, unfortunately, empathy for displaced people. We need to change the hearts and minds of Australians. I think, exactly. I mean, that's why we're here tonight. We're trying to educate ourselves and others. And that's why we have Refugee Week. So, that's the work of activism and campaigning. So on that, I'll pass over to Leslie for a farewell.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you, all panelists. Meredith, Randi and Kamal, and you, Tim. Yeah, I think we can say we've had a very successful first Zoom, but there's just so much, as Carolyn says in her chat message, there's so much to be done. But I think hearing the discussion tonight and seeing the film reinvigorates us in our determination to keep up that fight and to aim our efforts where we can, and certainly federal parliamentarians are in our sights. And after the restrictions are all lifted, we can take up the fight again in I suppose in more traditional ways, and I suppose also hope that some of the participants who haven't been as close to the issues as we have enjoyed the film and learnt a lot, and no doubt will be in touch. I had mentioned a sort of how can people support? Well, obviously by telling other people, just as Senia said in the film, and spreading that awareness, but also some of us donate regularly to a feeder. They have a ledger for Western Sahara, so we build up some funds there. And last year we had Tekba Ahmed Saleh visited, and that was really effective in raising awareness, and which is sort of the main aim of our organisation. And also some of those funds are used for humanitarian aid as well when there's crises. So that's a way that that support can be achieved. So I just thank you all again, and yeah, I think we might do it again, actually, and and I hope that you yes, zoom in. And thanks all again. Thanks very much, Afida and Tim.
And if anyone's interested, I have posted a couple links in the chat. We've got one link to the AWSA webpage and one link to the Union Abroad feeder page, where you can make donations to the AWSA ledger, or you can learn more about membership of AWSA on the AWSA webpage.
Right, thanks very much.
Yeah.
Thank you for a lovely discussion, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you again, everyone.
There's someone is raising a hand here. I don't know. What's that?
Who have we got?
I think it might be from Samantha's first comment where she said could be louder, possibly. I don't know.
Yeah, oh, that's just a pending question from Sam. Jill has a hand raised. Did you have another question, Jill? No, she's okay, she's fine. And everyone's sending through their thanks to the panelists and organisers. Good on you what? Okay.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Carl. Thanks, Tim.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
See ya.